Mario, can you hear us to provide the Spanish interpretation?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Hello, good evening. My name is Mario. I am the Spanish interpreter for the meeting tonight. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Mario, yo soy intérprete para español. Estaremos aquí para ayudarle. Si necesita la traducción del español, tendrá acceso al canal y en el globo que está abajo, selecciona el globo y entonces puede escoger el idioma español y accesar al canal para oír la traducción. Y si está en un teléfono móvil, tiene 3 punticos ahí arriba, aprieta y escoge el canal. Gracias, buenas tardes.
Thank you, Mario. I will now open the interpretation channel. Please give us one moment.
Sure.
Okay, the interpretation channel set up. Passing it back to you, Carrie.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you, Mario. So I am going to open it up first with some opening words from our commissioner, Ashley Randall, who has joined us today to speak about the program. So please welcome Commissioner Ashley Randall.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you to our entire MDAR team who is supporting the Resilient Food System Infrastructure Grant Program. This is really an exciting new opportunity for the department and a new program that USDA has launched. And tonight is really an opportunity for us to hear from you about middle of the system or middle of the supply chain, as USDA refers to it as, to see what the needs are and how we can effectively implement this program to make it the most valuable for the Massachusetts food system. And I'm so grateful to Carrie for leading this charge and leading this effort at the department. And again, we're just really looking forward to hearing from all of you tonight. And Carrie will provide an overview of the program and what the expectations are for this evening and the framework. So thank you again, and I'll now turn it back to Carrie.
Thank you, Commissioner. Really appreciate it. So before I jump into context for this grant program, I just wanted to note that the chat for this session is public record, but if you feel comfortable sharing your name and your organization, please feel free to do so in the chat function. So for the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Grant Program, or I'm going to now refer to as RFSI from now on, we have a couple people helping to kind of get this program started and determine funding priorities. So we have myself, Carrie Kornman, you just heard from Commissioner Ashley Randall. Today, helping us out for this session, we have myself, we have Rebecca Davidson, we have Melissa Adams, we have Benita Elke, and we have Rose Aruda, which I'm sure are some familiar names for you all. We also have Winton Pickoff joining tonight, who is our new Deputy Commissioner, so we're so happy to have him here as well. So a brief overview of our agenda for today. I'm going to go over what the RFSI program is, what we know about it so far from USDA, a timeline for MDAR and for the future of this grant. I'm going to have a description of the outreach that we're doing to determine funding priorities to help our constituents in Massachusetts and to best use this funding. We're going to briefly go over some past funding efforts and grant programs that are related to infrastructure purchases and infrastructure projects. So we have an idea of kind of what MDAR has done in the past. And then I will briefly go over some example areas of potential RFSI projects or funding areas so that we can kind of get thinking about the ways we can spend this money and what may be beneficial for your region. We will then be holding breakout room discussion. I believe we had a cutoff of under 15 people, but I think we have over 15 people now, so we should be able to do the breakout rooms. After that, we're going to just do a brief report out on those key discussion topics from the breakout rooms. And then after that time, we're going to have just general discussion and remarks. That's an opportunity to maybe make any comments or ask any questions that you couldn't cover in the breakout rooms. And finally, we'll be having closing words and any last final questions. We may not take up the entire 2-hour period. We're flexible with how this goes. We're just going to try to make sure that everyone is heard and all feedback is gathered. So what is the RFSI program? It's a program that was developed by USDA to work with states and tribal governments with the goal of developing and administering initiatives to build resilience across the middle of the food supply chain. The grant will utilize funds to support expanded capacity for the aggregation, processing, manufacturing, storing, transporting, and distribution of locally and regionally produced food products. That can include specialty crops, dairy, grains for human consumption, aquaculture, and other food products, but it's excluding meat and poultry. And the reason it's excluding meat and poultry is because there are other grant programs through USDA focus explicitly on meat and poultry. So the goals of this program are to support development of value-added products available to consumers. It's also to support projects that provide fair prices and fair wages, as well as new and safe job opportunities to keep profits in rural communities. And it's also to increase diversity and processing options in terms of business model approaches, geography, and availability to underserved communities. So essentially, states, including Massachusetts, are working with USDA to make competitive subawards to support infrastructure in the middle of the supply chain for domestic food and farm businesses and other eligible entities. As I mentioned, it's intended to serve middle of the supply chain needs, to add value and provide new and better markets for locally or regionally produced food. The program is to support the food system, crops, and products meant for human consumption. So some examples of ineligible products for this grant program in the future will be meat and poultry, as I discussed, wild caught seafood, animal feed, forage products, fiber, landscaping products, tobacco, or dietary supplements. So middle of the supply chain is a term that we're asking USDA to provide a hard definition for, and they are currently in the process of working on providing that hard definition for us. But for this meeting's purposes, MDAR has kind of defined it as the area between production and sales, which can include aggregation, processing, manufacturing, storing, transporting, and distribution. This program is going to be implemented in 2 phases. We're currently in phase 1. So all of the departments of agriculture within the states and territories have entered what's known as a cooperative agreement, or another way of receiving grant funds with USDA. Massachusetts will submit what's called a state plan, kind of like our application for funds, which will include a list of funding priorities specifically for the state of Massachusetts. And that is due no later than August 23rd, 2023. Again, that's what MDAR is submitting. There's no organizational application that's due before that date. Then there's phase 2, in which USDA will approve Massachusetts' state plan with the funding priorities that you will have provided input for today and through a survey. MDAR will develop and release what's called a request for response, or RFR, asking for infrastructure grant applications from agricultural stakeholders and organizations such as yourself. We expect the RFR to be released in fall of 2023. So entities that are eligible for these infrastructure grants will be agricultural producers or processors, nonprofit organizations operating with middle of the supply chain activities, local government entities operating middle of the supply chain activities, tribal governments, and institutions such as schools, universities, or hospitals. As long as those institutions or organizations are involved with middle of the supply chain activities, they are eligible to submit an application for these infrastructure grants. Massachusetts has roughly $3.4 million available through this RFSI funding. We know that the minimum infrastructure grant award amount will be $100,000. And we know that infrastructure grant recipients are required to contribute 50% of the total proposed project cost as match to the federal funding. Some applicants may qualify for reduced match requirements if they meet historically underserved farmers and ranchers status, or qualify under certain SBA categories, which will include women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, etc. We will not be going too far into details on what the application for MDAR subawardees will look like at this point. At this point, we are just trying to solicit feedback and comments so we can have a better idea of where the priorities for funding specifically for this program lie. We want to hear feedback so that we know how best constituents in the agricultural sector in the middle of the food supply chain can be served with this funding. We will have more information, including additional requirements, the application submission process, everything like that later on in the fall when we release our RFR. And I'm sure we will have a couple webinars available then as well. So the next steps, I kind of mentioned a little bit that we will have the RFR in the future. Immediately, we have to determine the funding priorities for our state plan. The outreach we've conducted to kind of source out what those funding priorities are is this listening session that you are a part of today. We also have an online survey that we distributed, and we are soliciting feedback through that survey as well. Rose will be putting in a link to that survey as well. As I mentioned, we plan to submit the state plan by August 23rd, release the RFR in fall of 2023, and we expect projects to begin in early 2024 with an end date of May 2027. So this is roughly a 2.5 year length grant program. All projects, including construction projects, are expected and mandatorily must be completed within that time frame. It's also important to note that USDA also has to approve our infrastructure grant subawards as well before we can finalize the contract process. So USDA is very involved with every step of this process with MDAR. As I mentioned, we had several outreach initiatives to determine funding priorities, the listening session, the survey. We sent out an e-blast with information and our newly created webpage for RFSI. Please check out the webpage if you want more information, and that would be the best way to receive updates regarding the program as well. We will also continue to send out email notifications as more information and more steps of the process roll out. I want to encourage you, if you know any other middle of the supply chain players in Massachusetts, please encourage them to fill out the survey. Rose should have put it in the chat. If you know anybody, please forward to them so that we can gather as much feedback as possible to make sure that we're incorporating feedback from agricultural stakeholders to make sure that we're meeting like these gaps in funding that can help the state. Now I'm going to pass it off to Rose Arruda, and she's going to go over some past infrastructure grant programs that MDAR and EEA have held recently so that we have a better idea of what infrastructure grants have looked like in the past.
Sure. Thanks, Carrie. And thanks for everyone for being here. As many of you know, Massachusetts has been investing in our food system infrastructure, and specifically at MDAR, we have a suite of programs that are supporting our food producers, our aquaculture businesses, the state's food bank system, and so much more. As you see on the screen here, the FSIG program was launched during the COVID crisis, and its programming has heavily invested in the strengthening our food system. And whether it's rural or urban, big or small, the projects have reached every county in the state. The numbers you see on the screen represent so many farms, hundreds of farms, pantries, school systems, and so much more. The farm projects specifically in this funding have a common theme. And that theme are projects that have to do with processing, distribution, greenhouses, irrigation, storage, cold storage, markets, and so much more. And I also want to point out one item from this year's funding, the 26 million, just so we can get some context to this. For the cold storage and walk-in coolers, there were 47 projects that were funded. $9 million was invested in 47 projects for cold storage and walk-in cooler space across the state. And another item I'll put in there is the greenhouse infrastructure. 13 projects were funded with a $1.5 million investment, and that's just for this fiscal year. So there's a lot of work happening with FSIG, and that theme of projects is what's been funded, but it also represents what hasn't been funded. The Food Venture Program, my favorite program, started in 2017, pretty much funds the same types of projects, only they have to be commercially based, and they have to be based and impact low to moderate income communities. Again, that's commercial kitchens, distribution centers, food hubs, infrastructure. It could be irrigation, it could be greenhouses. Again, rural, urban, small, large projects. They've been making a really important impacts across the state. And I know there are quite a few folks here on the call that have received those grants, and we can attest to the fact that whether it's a small grant or a large grant, they've made a really positive impact on organizations, and just as importantly, the surrounding community that you're serving. So I think it's really up to you and your networks to let us know what you think the gaps are in our food systems network, thinking strategically on where we can fill the gap in with this new program. And I'm looking forward to those conversations in our breakout sessions. Thank you, Carrie.
Thanks so much, Rose. Okay, so I'm going to go over some kinds of types of projects that could be funded through this programming, to kind of get you thinking along the lines of what's eligible, what's not, so that you can have that in mind when we go into our breakout rooms and start discussing gaps in your areas regarding funding. So they're looking for projects that expand capacity for those middle of the supply chain activities. They're looking for projects that modernize manufacturing, tracking, storage, and IT systems. Enhancing worker safety through new technologies or investments. They're looking for improvements to the capacity of entities that need it to help comply with maybe federal, state, or local food safety requirements. They're looking for projects to improve operations through training opportunities, job creation opportunities, construction of new facilities, or making improvements or modernizing, expanding facilities, and increasing equipment purchases. They're also looking for examples, construction of wastewater management structures. That's just one example. I mentioned modernizing equipment or developing, customizing, and installing new equipment that reduces greenhouse gas emissions or helps with USDA's climate action goals. So this is not a comprehensive list. I'm sure there's other ways organizations may be able to think of infrastructure needs beyond just this list. But this is to kind of start getting us thinking along the lines of what could be eligible. Just to expand upon that, here's a list of some allowable activities. Again, these aren't limited to just strictly these activities, but hiring term limited personnel to assist with implementation, purchasing special purpose equipment. So that includes equipment that is like of specialized nature that will benefit multiple producers in the middle of the supply chain with activities like processing, aggregating, distributing, etc. Analyzing potential facility upgrades and changes to meet regulatory requirements. Planning for hazard analysis critical control points, or HACCP. And just general upgrades or new facilities relating to processing specific agricultural products. That can include post-harvest processing, cleaning and grading, aggregator warehouse and storage, purchasing freezer equipment, cold storage, processing, canning, preserving, pasteurization equipment, equipment for preparation and packing, equipment for drying, hulling, shelling, and equipment for cooking, baking, juicing, etc. Some ineligible project types would be acquiring property, including land purchases. Projects that are focused on meat or poultry processing, because those are ineligible agricultural products for this grant. If you are meat or poultry processing, please reach out to me and I can direct you towards some meat and poultry processing grants through USDA. You cannot have activities be paid for that are being paid for through other federal awards from another federal grant program. You cannot claim expenses that have or will be reimbursed under any federal, state, or local government funding. So you can't request, like say you receive Massachusetts Food Ventures Program funding for a certain project. You can't request RFSI funding for the same project or expenses. And projects which have already received funding from another federal grant or subaward program may not receive funding for the same activities. Pretty redundant. However, infrastructure grants may build on the successes of prior funding, such as the USDA Regional Food Business Centers, Business Builder subawards, to fund subsequent activities after the completion of a previous grant. I want to add that MDAR will prioritize projects that benefit the following groups. That includes underserved farmers or ranchers, new and beginning farmers or ranchers, veteran producers, and processors and other middle of the supply businesses owned by socially disadvantaged individuals as defined by the Small Business Administration. I also want to note that these definitions for the terms that I've just used come from USDA. I don't have it pulled up right now, but I can find that web page that links to the definitions of these terms through USDA. But for MDAR's purposes, we are using USDA's terms for these groups. So we are going to end the presentation recording here. We are also going to close the interpretation channel. And we are going to hold some breakout sessions with smaller groups of attendees.